Hello everyone. Today's teaching assistant is once again Max. Say hello, Max. Max is the smallest of my cats, but also the fattest because she loves food. All food, all the time. All right, goodbye, Max. Thank you for your assistance. Today we're going to discuss ethics and supervision. This is part of the worker and organizational experience as component of evidence-based practice. Our ethical principles and the type of supervision we receive can help us in addressing our individual biases and in reducing that practice noise that can impact our work. So when thinking about social work and ethics, we need to remember that every social worker fills two professional roles. The first is as helper/enabler, and the second is as a social control agent. So it's really important to decide what should be done rather than what can be done. And ethics is what concerns what actions are morally right and how things ought to be, while professional ethics, more specifically, are the codes of obligations that arise out of a person's voluntary choice to become a professional. And these are the ones that are usually developed and codified by our professional bodies. In Ontario, that's the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. Now, because we are both an enabler/helper and a societal control engine, we run into some ethical problems. So we need to consider what is the right thing to do in the practice situation, and how can a social worker avoid unethical behaviors in that situation. On the other hand, an ethical dilemma occurs when the social worker has to choose between two or more relevant but contradictory ethical directives, or when every alternative results in a potentially undesirable outcome for one or more persons. Some social workers may ignore ethical problems and dilemmas, either because they're uncomfortable with making ethical decisions or because they think they already have the answer. The problem with this is that if you ignore an ethical problem, it's not just going to go away. It will come back to impact both the social worker and their clients. So some of the causes of ethical problems can be competing values. For instance, an ethical dilemma may arise when a social worker is faced with two or more competing values, such as confidentiality and the protection of life. What is a practice example of a social worker faced with competing values? For instance, a worker may feel equally committed to two values in a specific situation. For example, when we might become aware of a client who expresses concern for someone they know's child, that they might be experiencing child maltreatment. In that case, you have the competing values of confidentiality for your client versus the duty to report the child maltreatment. In this case, the ethical problem is solved by Ontario laws, which make social workers mandatory reporters, and the right to confidentiality is superseded by the right of the child to safety. Another cause of ethical problems can be competing loyalties. For instance, you might face an ethical dilemma when competing or conflicting groups make claims on your loyalties. So to whom do you owe loyalty? To yourself, the service user, the agency? This is particularly prevalent when you work and live in the same community. So our first goal as social workers is to protect their clients' rights and welfare. So the definition of rights and privileges has changed over time. What is thought to be right at one time may not be in another era. For instance, we were once expected to protect confidentiality no matter the obstacles, but now things have changed. The changing definition of rights can create ethical problems for social workers. An example would be the right of adopted person to information about their biological parents in cases where the biological parents requested confidentiality. As social workers, we're also responsible for the protection of society's interests. Social control role of a social worker versus a helping relationship. is where this comes in. For instance, a client could disclose that he has committed a property crime. So what do you do in that case? Do you work as the social work practitioner and focus on the individual relationship, or on the social worker as a social control agent? In this case, our laws and statutes as social workers tell us that property crime, as long as nobody was hurt and in the future is unlikely for somebody to be hurt, is not sufficient to break confidentiality. We also have the least harm principle that can be used when we're faced with problems with no positive choices. So the least harm rule suggests choosing the option that will result in the least amount of harm, the least permanent harm, or the most easily reversible harm. And you really need to consider the least harm to whom. And the answer to that is to the client, to yourself, and to the agency and society. We have our ethical principles to help us when it comes to ethical decision making. As a reminder, the first is protection of life. Second is equality and inequality. Third is autonomy and freedom for people, aka self-determination. Number 4 is what I just mentioned, least harm. Number 5 is the quality of life for all people in the community. Number 6 is privacy and confidentiality to the extent possible under the law. And lastly, but not leastly, truthfulness and full disclosure with the client. And it's important to remember that these ethical principles are not actually in any kind of order. So just because the first principle is right to life and principle 7 is truthfulness and disclosure doesn't mean that truthfulness and disclosure is less important than privacy and confidentiality. So when two of these might not lead you to the same decision, you really need to consider for that specific situation which one is more important. Let's turn now to supervision. Supervision is a safe space where workers and students can critically reflect on their thinking and practice and receive support and encouragement to develop their preferred professional identity. Supervision is a well-established component of social work practice, and through it, we try to engage in a relationship with the supervisor to enable both a place and space to refine and develop our professional identity, our knowledge and skills, and to reflectively examine the challenges that we face in our practice. Supervision in social work is guided by the Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. And it has 3 basic practice responsibilities. The first is the respect for each person's inherent dignity and worth and recognition of human rights. So, as you can see, it mirrors quite closely the Code of Ethics that all social workers have to follow. Second is the recognition of social justice as a core societal and professional obligation. And third is enacting professional integrity that includes an awareness of power relations in professional relationships and a demonstrated commitment to transparent and accountable practice. So, because supervisors typically have more power than workers, this is a particularly important component and really calls into the forefront the responsibility social worker supervisors have in the supervision of their workers and in the effect their workers will then have on community and society. Supervision can also be your primary self-care and can contribute to the resilience and longevity of you in this profession. This is a very stressful and challenging profession, and when you're inspired or challenged or have a light bulb moment, you need to allow yourself to be vulnerable into changing your assumptions, cultural bias, etc. And your supervisor can really help with that, can help point out how to deal with stress, how to deal with challenges, and to teach you something new. However, for supervisors to facilitate and deliver actual effective supervision, that requires a lot of energy, preparation, training, and ongoing development. So there are 4 central concepts in supervision that we're going to cover. First is professional autonomy. So this means professional freedom and the owning of the expertise in a particular realm of service. So it means having legitimacy in knowing what you're doing in a certain field of expertise and safeguarding of professional power. So ensuring that only those who are competent to engage in that practice are actually doing it and not just anybody. Next is professional discretion, and that refers to the relationship between professional agency and organizational rules, and to the tension between policy and day-to-day professional practice, because this in turn causes problems for professional ethics and, of course, for professional autonomy. Sometimes those organizational rules are not exactly in line with what's happening on the ground, with what clients are actually experiencing, and this as well can cause ethical dilemmas. Third, we've got professional agency. So agency in the context of concerns regarding professional autonomy can be understood as something between professional discretion and freedom and the contextual and organizational control that decreases your autonomy and can even threaten the core values of professional social work. So agency is also critical when discussing critical reflection, professional identity, and the subjective position of professionals, and it stands as a central concept for theories of supervision. So it's really recognizing the fact that any choices that you make and the choices then that your workers can make and that your clients have are all within professional context of an agency or organization and in its policies. So it impacts the freedom you have in what you can do, both because of resources and because of policy that's available. And lastly, we've got professional supervision. So this is an essential part of professional occupational practice, in that supervision is a key factor in the promotion of practice excellence, productivity, and practitioner retention. Without quality supervision, social workers are much more likely to experience burnout and to leave the profession. If there is quality supervision, they're able to maintain their employment longer and experience higher levels of job satisfaction. Traditionally, supervision has really focused on promoting high-quality professional services by supporting, learning and management and development of professional practice. But more and more, it's also recognizing that we also need to support social workers as people and encourage their self-care and their reflexivity and ensure that they're not just living for the job, they're also able to live and prosper outside of their profession as well. So the supervisor not only ensures that the workers are doing the work correctly, but that the workers have a work-life balance. And when that's not possible for whatever reasons, then they connect the worker to needed resources to get them back on track. So in summary, social workers really need to be aware of how their own organizational biases, might not align with the code of ethics. And supervision can be a great help in dealing with ethical dilemmas, provided that the relationship between social workers and their supervisors is positive. The role of supervisor is key in how effective the social worker can be in their practice.